In October 1941, a German general who had already conquered Poland and driven deep into France wrote back to Berlin, in effect, that his tanks could no longer beat the enemies. Not struggled against, couldn't beat. His own words described the shock as less physical than spiritual, an admission that the war he thought he understood had just changed underneath him, delivered by a smaller, hastily assembled Soviet force, using a tank that on paper shouldn't have been able to do what it did. The tank that did that to him wasn't bigger than his, it wasn't dramatically better armed. What it had was a combination nobody on the German side had planned for. Armor sloped at an angle that could shrug off hits a flat plate would have taken straight, a diesel engine that didn't catch fire the way German petrol engines did, and tracks wide enough to keep moving through mud and snow that stopped everything else cold. It also had a two-man turret so cramped the commander had to aim the gun himself, no radios in most of the early production tanks, and quality control so inconsistent that two T-34s built the same month at the same factory could genuinely differ in reliability. This is the story of a tank that was never the best engineered vehicle of the war, and became, by most measures, the most important one anyway. Roughly 84,000 were built, across a production run that outlasted the war itself by nearly a decade. That number alone tells you most of what you need to know before we even start. Before we go further, everything in this episode is sourced and cross-checked against published military histories, production records, and specification data from multiple independent references, not just the version of this story that gets repeated the most on the internet. Where the record is solid, we'll give it to you straight. Where it's genuinely disputed, and the single engagement most associated with this tank's reputation is disputed in exactly the way you'd expect once propaganda and wartime record-keeping get involved, we'll tell you that too, and tell you why. Full source list is in the description below. To understand the T-34, you have to understand what Soviet tank designers were actually trying to solve in the late 1930s, and it wasn't the problem you might expect. It wasn't primarily about beating a specific German tank. It was about ending a design compromise that had plagued Soviet armor for a decade, the trade-off between speed and armor. Soviet tank design through the 1930s had produced fast, thinly armored cavalry-style tanks, the BT series, built for exactly the kind of deep, rapid maneuver warfare Soviet theorists were increasingly interested in. The problem was obvious on paper before it ever showed up on a battlefield. Speed doesn't help a crew that's already dead, and thin armor stops almost nothing. A design team led by Mikhail Koshkin working through the late 1930s set out to build a tank that kept the BT series' mobility without the same fragility. The breakthrough wasn't a single component, it was a combination of three separate engineering decisions, each one solid on its own, that turned out to compound into something much greater together. First, sloped armor. Plates angled rather than vertical, which effectively increases the thickness a shell has to punch through at an angle, and increases the chance of a shell deflecting entirely rather than penetrating at all. Second, a diesel engine, the V2, rather than the petrol engines most other nations were using, which meant a T-34 hit in the engine compartment was far less likely to erupt into the kind of fire that made a hit anywhere near a petrol tank often fatal for the crew. Third, wide tracks that spread the tank's weight over a larger surface area, keeping ground pressure low enough to cross mud and snow that bogged down narrower tracked vehicles almost immediately. None of those three ideas was entirely new or unique to the Soviets. What was new was building all three into the same vehicle at the same time on a chassis designed from the outset to be producible in enormous numbers using relatively unskilled wartime labor and simplified interchangeable components. That last part matters as much as the engineering. A tank that's brilliant on a test range but impossible to mass produce doesn't win a war of attrition. The T-34 was designed to be good enough, built by the millions of workers the Soviet war economy could actually mobilize, rather than perfect and built by the handful of master craftsmen a more complex design would have required. It's worth being specific about what designed for mass production actually meant in practice, because it's easy to treat as a vague slogan rather than a real engineering discipline. Components were standardized and simplified wherever possible, so that parts from one factory's output could be used to repair a tank built at a completely different factory hundreds of kilometers away. Tolerances were kept loose enough that semi-skilled labor, including, as the war ground on, a workforce increasingly made up of women, teenagers, and older workers filling in for men sent to the front, could assemble and maintain the vehicle without years of specialized training. Cast turret sections, rather than the more labor-intensive welded plate construction used on some rival designs, sped up production further on later variants, even at some cost to overall armor quality consistency. Every one of these choices traded a small amount of individual vehicle refinement for a large amount of aggregate manufacturing speed, precisely the opposite bet German heavy tank design was making at almost exactly the same time. Here's the thesis worth holding on to for the rest of this episode. The T-34 wasn't the best tank on any single measured spec sheet category when it appeared, and for most of the war, it wasn't the best tank on any single spec sheet category among its contemporaries either. It won on the combination, and it won even harder on the fact that the Soviet Union could actually build it in numbers that made individual tactical disadvantages almost irrelevant. The path from prototype to production wasn't smooth or guaranteed, and it's worth spending a moment on it because the T-34 almost didn't happen the way it did. Koshkin's design team faced real internal skepticism from within the Soviet military bureaucracy. Some of it centered on the diesel engine, an unusual and at the time more expensive choice than adapting an existing petrol design. And some of it centered on whether a wheeled and tracked hybrid design, closer to the older BT lineage, might be a safer bet than committing fully to a new tracks-only vehicle. Kushkin reportedly pushed hard for the fully tracked version, arguing it offered better armor protection and simpler production at the cost of the BT series' wheel road flexibility. A bet that turned out to be exactly right, though Kushkin himself didn't live to see how right it was. He died of pneumonia in 1940, not long after personally driving early prototypes on a grueling long-distance road trial from Kharkiv to Moscow, specifically to demonstrate the design's reliability to skeptical Soviet leadership.
Where the Tiger I stood out because every individual component was pushed to an extreme, the T-34 stood out because nothing about it was extreme, and that turned out to be exactly the point. T-34, 1941 production, key specifications. Main armament, 76.2 mm F-34 tank gun, approximately 77 rounds carried. Secondary armament, 2 x 7.62 mm DT machine guns. Armor, 45 mm, sloped at up to 60 degrees on the hull front and turret. Weight, approximately 26 to 28 tons. Crew, 4. Commander, gunner, loader, bow gunner/radio operator. Engine, V2-34 V12 diesel, approximately 500 horsepower. Speed, approximately 53 km per hour on road. Range, roughly 300 to 400 km depending on fuel load and terrain. Start with the armor, because the sloping is the single most influential idea this tank contributed to tank design worldwide, copied by nearly every major tank-producing nation within a few years. At 45 mm, the T-34's frontal armor wasn't thick by the standards that heavy tanks like the Tiger or the KV-2 would soon set. But sloped at up to 60 degrees, that 45 mm plate presented an effective thickness closer to double its actual measurement to an incoming shell striking it head-on, and a meaningful percentage of hits simply deflected off the angled surface entirely rather than striking with full force. German gunners in 1941, trained against flat vertical plates of French and Polish tanks, watched rounds that should have penetrated skip harmlessly off the T-34's glacis. The gun, a 76.2 mm weapon, generally known by its factory designation F-34, was a genuinely solid, well-balanced tank gun for 1941, powerful enough to defeat the armor on every German tank then in service at reasonable combat ranges, without the outsized size and weight penalties a larger weapon would have imposed on the rest of the design. It's worth noting this gun would eventually become outclassed, and we'll get to exactly when and why later in this episode. But at the moment the T-34 first appeared on the battlefield, it was more than adequate for anything German designers had fielded. Now the part of the spec sheet that doesn't get nearly as much attention in the popular retelling, the turret. Early T-34 production used a two-man turret, meaning the tank commander doubled as the gunner, aiming and firing the main weapon himself on top of the normal command duties of watching the battlefield, coordinating with other tanks, and making tactical decisions. Compare that to a three-man turret arrangement, commander, gunner, loader working as separate roles used in contemporary German medium tanks like the Panzer III and Panzer IV, and the disadvantage becomes clear.
A T-34 commander overloaded with the gunner's job had measurably less attention available for battlefield awareness, and it showed in engagement outcomes, particularly against German crews who could out-coordinate a numerically similar T-34 formation through better internal division of labor. Visibility compounded the problem. Early T-34s lacked a commander's cupola, the raised windowed observation position that let a tank commander see the battlefield without exposing his upper body outside the hatch. Without one, T-34 commanders often had to expose themselves through an open hatch to get useful situational awareness, a real and repeatedly fatal vulnerability that Soviet designers didn't fully address until later production runs. And then there's radios, or in a great many early production T-34s, the lack of them. Radio equipment was scarce and expensive relative to Soviet production capacity in 1941 and 1942, and many T-34 units coordinated using flag signals from a lead command tank that did carry a radio, the same practice we've noted on this channel with early KV-2 units. In a fast-moving armored engagement, a formation that can't talk to itself in real time is a formation that reacts slower than one that can, regardless of how good any individual tank's armor or gun happens to be. One more thing worth knowing, because it explains a recurring theme in how this tank actually performed. Build quality varied enormously, tank to tank, factory to factory, and even month to month at the same factory. Wartime production pressure, evacuated and hastily reassembled factories, and a constantly rotating, often inexperienced workforce meant a T-34 built in careful conditions in 1940 and a T-34 rushed off the line in the chaos of 1942 could be, functionally, two different vehicles wearing the same silhouette. It's worth pausing on ammunition and fuel, too, since both connect directly to how a T-34 crew actually fought and how far a T-34 unit could operate before needing resupply. With around 300 to 400 kilometers of range, depending on fuel load and terrain, the T-34 had genuinely useful operational reach for fast, deep armored thrusts Soviet doctrine increasingly favored as the war progressed, a meaningful contrast to the shorter effective range German heavy tanks like the Tiger managed once real-world fuel consumption is factored in, rather than a spec sheet maximum. Ammunition stowage on early production tanks held around 77 rounds of 76mm ammunition, later increased on some variants, enough for a sustained engagement without needing to fall back for resupply mid-fight, an important practical consideration for a tank increasingly used in deep offensive operations rather than purely defensive ones.
Now, the story that gave this tank its reputation, the engagement that made a hardened, victorious German general write home that something fundamental had changed. A note before we tell it. Like nearly every dramatic single engagement we've covered on this channel, the casualty figures here vary enormously between Soviet and German sources for reasons that will sound familiar if you watched our KV-2 or Tiger 1 episodes. In early October 1941, German forces under General Heinz Guderian, by this point a highly experienced, highly successful Panzer commander who had led breakthroughs in Poland and France, were pushing toward the town of Mtsensk, part of the broader German drive on Moscow. Opposing them was a hastily formed Soviet unit, the 4th Tank Brigade, commanded by Colonel Mikhail Katakov, equipped with a mix of T-34s, a handful of KV heavy tanks, and older light tanks. Rather than meet the advancing German 4th Panzer Division head-on in open ground, where numbers and experience favored the Germans, Katakov concealed his T-34s in wooded terrain along the road the German column was using, with multiple prepared firing positions for each tank, so that no single Soviet vehicle had to hold one exposed spot for long. As German armor approached, the T-34s opened fire from concealment at close range. Several accounts describe engagement distances as short as 200 to 300 meters before repositioning to new prepared locations, making it difficult for German gunners to identify and suppress the ambush effectively. Here's where the hedging has to be deliberate. The German losses are reported very differently depending on the source. Some Soviet-era accounts cite German losses as high as 133 tanks over the roughly 9 days of fighting it took the German column to cover the 60 kilometers from Orel to Mtsensk.
German unit records from the same period, where they survive and have been cross-referenced by post-war historians, generally describe meaningfully lower losses, though still significant enough to noticeably slow the advance. Part of the discrepancy comes from a detail worth understanding rather than glossing over. The Germans held the battlefield at the end of most individual engagements in this campaign, which meant damaged German tanks were often recovered and repaired rather than being permanent losses, while a simple battlefield tally taken by the retreating Soviet side wouldn't have been able to distinguish a permanently destroyed tank from one that would be back in service within days. Soviet losses are comparatively better documented and modest. Brigade records cited by multiple historians put irrecoverable Soviet losses at around 6 T-34s destroyed outright, out of a considerably larger force, alongside broader personnel casualties, a genuinely favorable exchange ratio for the defenders, even using the more conservative German loss estimates rather than the higher Soviet-era figures. What isn't seriously disputed is the qualitative outcome, and this is the part that actually matters for understanding why this engagement became so significant. Guderian's advance, which had been moving quickly and confidently for months, was stopped or badly slowed for several days by a numerically smaller, hastily assembled Soviet force, using ambush tactics rather than a fair, symmetrical fight. And in the aftermath, Guderian's own post-war writing describes the encounter in terms that go well beyond a routine tactical setback, describing a real crisis of confidence about German tank design and doctrine, and requesting that a technical commission be sent to inspect captured and destroyed T-34s directly from the battlefield. That inspection had consequences that outlived the battle itself by years. The German response to what its own tank designers found when they examined captured T-34s directly from the battlefield actively influenced the design of the Panther medium tank that followed, a vehicle that borrowed the T-34 sloped armor concept almost directly, adapted into a design that was, in nearly every other respect, far more mechanically complex and far less reliable than the tank that had inspired it. We'll cover that tank and that irony in a future episode on this channel. We're telling you the Mtsensk story with this much hedging because the alternative, repeating the higher Soviet-era casualty figure as settled fact, is exactly the kind of number that gets corrected in a comment section within the hour, the same way an inflated figure would for any other tank we've covered. The real story doesn't need the inflated number. A smaller, less experienced Soviet force stopping one of Germany's most capable Panzer commanders for the better part of a week using a tank that shouldn't have been able to outfight the Wehrmacht on paper is dramatic in its own right. It's also worth noting that Mtsensk wasn't an isolated fluke, even if it's the single most cited example. German forces had actually first encountered T-34s and KV series tanks within days of the initial invasion in June 1941, months before Mtsensk, and those earlier encounters had already generated concerned reports working their way up the German chain of command about Soviet armor that outmatched anything German guns could reliably beat. What made Mtsensk different wasn't that it revealed a previously unknown problem. It's that it happened to a sufficiently senior, sufficiently respected commander in a sufficiently concentrated and costly engagement that the concern could no longer be dismissed as scattered frontline exaggeration. Guderian's report carried weight that earlier, more junior accounts hadn't, and that's a large part why this specific battle, rather than an earlier and arguably comparably significant encounter, became the one German industry and doctrine actually reorganized around. Here's where the T-34's story departs sharply from every other tank we've covered on this channel so far. This is the rare case where the operational record and the legend actually point in largely the same direction once you account for real and significant flaws that never stopped the tank from being decisive at scale. The clearest way to understand the T-34's operational impact is through production numbers, because this tank's real advantage was never really about winning individual duels. It was about winning the numbers game so decisively that individual tactical disadvantages stopped mattering. Soviet factories built T-34s in numbers that dwarfed anything Germany could match, tens of thousands of units across the war, produced even while major factories were being evacuated hundreds of kilometers eastward ahead of the advancing German army and reassembled, sometimes literally in open fields, under freezing conditions, with production resuming within weeks. No German tank program, including the vaunted Tiger and Panther lines, ever approached that combination of volume and wartime resilience. That production advantage didn't erase the tank's real operational problems, though. The two-man turret and missing radios we covered in Section 4 showed up consistently in unit-level accounts throughout 1941 and into 1942 as genuine combat disadvantages. German crews with better internal coordination and communication frequently outperformed numerically similar T-34 formations in engagements where the T-34's armor and gun should have made the fight roughly even. Soviet tank crews were, especially early in the war, also often thrown into combat with minimal training, a consequence of catastrophic personnel losses during the opening months of the German invasion and the urgent need to replace destroyed units faster than proper training programs could realistically support. Reliability was a genuine strength in some respects and a genuine liability in others, and it's worth being precise about which is which. The tank's rugged, relatively simple mechanical design meant that in the hands of an experienced crew and maintenance team, operational readiness rates by 1943 reportedly reached somewhere in the range of 70 to 90% in many units, genuinely excellent numbers, and a sharp contrast with the readiness struggles we documented for the Tiger I. But that figure obscures real variation driven by the build quality inconsistency mentioned earlier. A T-34 from a factory and production batch known for careful assembly could be dramatically more dependable than one rushed off a line during the worst of the 1941-42 evacuation crisis, and unit commanders learned informally which factory codes and production runs to trust more than others. The tank's cross-country mobility, particularly in mud and snow, was a real and consistently reported advantage throughout the war. German tank crews operating narrower-tracked vehicles with higher ground pressure repeatedly found themselves immobilized in conditions T-34s could traverse without much difficulty, a mobility gap that shaped operational tempo on the Eastern Front in ways that went well beyond any single engagement. The Battle of Stalingrad and the broader Soviet counteroffensives of 1942 and 1943 illustrate the production advantage translating directly into operational outcomes. Soviet planners were able to concentrate genuinely enormous numbers of T-34s at decisive points along the front, made possible by rail networks feeding a production system that, despite the chaos of factory evacuation, never actually stopped delivering new tanks in significant quantity. That concentration of force at chosen points, rather than a thin, even spread across the entire front, let Soviet commanders create local numerical superiority even in periods when German forces retained a real qualitative edge in crew trading or individual tank capability. It's a pattern that repeats across the whole war. The T-34 didn't need to win every individual engagement because there were enough of them that losing some still left enough to achieve the operational objective. Diesel fuel supply, worth flagging as a secondary but real factor, gave the T-34 one more quiet advantage over German petrol-engine tanks. Diesel is generally less volatile and somewhat more resistant to certain types of ignition than gasoline, meaning a T-34 hit in a non-critical area had a comparatively better chance of the crew surviving without a catastrophic fire than a petrol-engine tank taking a similar hit, a difference crews on both sides reportedly noticed and discussed, even if it never showed up as a formal spec sheet advantage the way armor thickness or gun caliber did. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, which we referenced in both our KV-2 and Tiger I episodes, is worth revisiting briefly from the T-34's side of the ledger, because it illustrates the tank's real limitations just as clearly as it illustrates German heavy armor's mechanical fragility. T-34 units engaging German Tigers and up-armored Panzer IVs at Kursk frequently found themselves needing to close to much shorter ranges than their opponents to achieve reliable penetration with the 76mm gun, a tactically costly requirement that exposed T-34 crews to accurate long-range German fire for longer than a more evenly matched gun versus armor situation would have required. Soviet tank crews, especially early in the war, were also often thrown into combat with minimal training, a consequence of catastrophic personnel losses during the opening months of the German invasion and the urgent need to replace destroyed units faster than proper training programs could realistically support.
If you know tanks, you already know most of this, because we've mentioned several of these flaws already in setting up why the tank's advantages mattered as much as they did. We're naming them plainly here because pretending the T-34 was a flawless design would insult the audience just as much as pretending the KV-2 or the Tiger I had none. The two-man turret and commander overload. We covered this in Section 4, but it belongs here as a headline flaw, not a footnote. Forcing the tank commander to also aim and fire the main gun measurably degraded battlefield awareness and coordination, and it's a flaw Soviet designers were fully aware of and didn't fully correct until the later T-34-85 variant introduced a proper three-man turret, a fix that arrived only after roughly 2.5 years of the earlier, more compromised arrangement had already shaped countless engagements. Missing radios in early production. Also covered above, and also a flaw the Soviets were aware of and gradually corrected as production capacity allowed. But gradually corrected meant a meaningful stretch of the war fought by formations that often couldn't coordinate in real time. Poor visibility and vulnerable commander positioning. The lack of a proper commander's cupola on early production tanks was a real, repeatedly fatal design gap. It's a small component in the grand scheme of a tank's overall design, and it cost lives disproportionate to its size. Inconsistent build quality. This is the flaw that's hardest to pin down with a single number, precisely because it varied so much, but it's consistently reported across unit histories and post-war technical assessments alike. Wartime pressure, evacuated factories, and inexperienced labor meant the T-34 you got depended meaningfully on which factory built it and when, in a way that a more centralized, consistently overseen production program wouldn't have produced. Crew comfort and finishing quality. Interior fit and finish, welding quality on some batches, and general ergonomic comfort were consistently reported by crews, including, after the war, by American and British technical evaluators who examined captured or Lend-Lease adjacent examples as rougher than contemporary German or American designs. This wasn't a tank built for crew comfort, it was a tank built to be produced fast, in huge numbers, and that trade-off shows up in exactly the areas you'd expect it to. The gun eventually fell behind. The 76.2mm F-34 that was more than adequate in 1941 became a genuine liability by mid to late 1943, once Germany fielded up-armored Panzer IVs, the new Panther and the Tiger I in significant numbers. Soviet designers responded with the T-34-85, mounting a larger 85mm gun capable of dealing with the newer German armor at practical ranges, but that upgrade didn't reach mass production and widespread service until very late 1943 and into 1944, meaning T-34 crews fought a meaningful stretch of the war's middle years in a tank whose main weapon was falling behind the threats it was facing. None of this erases what the T-34 accomplished. It just tells you that the accomplishment came despite real, well-documented shortcomings, not because the design was without flaws, a distinction this audience will appreciate more than a simplified wonder weapon version of the story. There's one more flaw worth naming, because it's less about the tank itself and more about the human cost of the production system that built it. Wartime Soviet tank crew training was, for large stretches of the war, dangerously compressed. Replacement crews were sometimes sent into combat after only a few weeks of instruction, a direct consequence of catastrophic losses in the war's opening months and the urgent operational need to keep units at strength faster than a proper training pipeline could support. A well-designed tank crewed by an inexperienced, undertrained crew loses fights it should win, and Soviet unit records and post-war Western assessments alike describe this as a real, persistent drag on the T-34's battlefield performance, particularly relative to German crews, who, for most of the war, retained a meaningful training and experience advantage, even as their equipment became increasingly outnumbered.
Unlike the KV-2, or even the Tiger I, the T-34's story doesn't end with the war. Production of various T-34 variants continued in the Soviet Union into the early 1950s, and the tank saw service, sometimes decades of service, with dozens of countries around the world, in conflicts stretching from the immediate post-war period through the Korean War, various Middle Eastern conflicts, and beyond. Some T-34s reportedly remained in at least limited operational or reserve status with some militaries into the 21st century, an almost unheard-of service lifespan for a tank designed in the late 1930s. Total wartime production is generally put at around 84,000 T-34s across all variants, 76mm armed and 85mm armed combined, a figure that dwarfs the KV-2's few hundred and the Tiger I's roughly 1,347 by orders of magnitude. That number is, in a very real sense, the tank's most important specification, more consequential to the outcome of the war on the Eastern Front than any single armor thickness or gun caliber figure.
The T-34-85, introduced in late 1943, addressed the tank's most significant flaws in one upgrade: a proper three-man turret, ending the commander as gunner problem, a larger 85mm gun capable of engaging up-armored German tanks at practical combat ranges, and improved radios as standard equipment rather than a scarce upgrade. It's worth being direct about what that means for how we should think about the T-34's overall legacy. The tank that shocked Guderian at Mtsensk in 1941 and the tank that helped spearhead the final drive into Berlin in 1945 were, in important respects, meaningfully different vehicles wearing a broadly similar silhouette, the later version correcting real problems the earlier version genuinely had. That upgrade came at a real cost, worth noting for the sake of completeness. The T-34-85 was heavier and somewhat more expensive to produce than its predecessor, and the larger turret ring required to fit the bigger gun meant retooling that briefly slowed production output during the transition, at a point in the war when the Soviet Union could least afford any interruption to tank deliveries. Soviet planners judged the trade-off worthwhile, and the historical record broadly vindicates that judgment, but it's a useful reminder that even the T-34's most celebrated late-war improvement wasn't a free upgrade with no downside, any more than the original design's mass production simplicity had been. The T-34's influence on post-war tank design worldwide is difficult to overstate. Sloped armor, the central insight the design contributed, became standard practice for essentially every major tank-producing nation within a decade, including on vehicles built by the same Western nations whose earlier tanks the T-34 had so thoroughly outclassed in armor protection. Surviving examples exist today in museums, and in some cases running collections around the world, a testament to just how many were built and how long individual examples have managed to survive. So why does the T-34 sit where it does in tank history? Not the most feared single vehicle of the war, the way the Tiger I was, but arguably the most consequential. Because the T-34 solved a different problem than the Tiger or the KV-2 ever tried to solve. Those tanks were built to win individual engagements at any cost, and largely succeeded at exactly that narrow goal. The T-34 was built to win a war of industrial attrition, a goal that required good enough performance multiplied by overwhelming numbers, rather than excellent performance multiplied by a small, expensive, hard-to-sustain fleet. It had real, documented, sometimes fatal flaws. It also proved, more clearly than almost any single weapon system of the war, that in a long industrial conflict, a design that can actually be built in the numbers a war demands beats a design that can't, no matter how impressive that other design looks on a spec sheet. There's a broader comparison worth making explicitly here, tying together everything this channel has covered so far. The KV-2 chose specialization over flexibility and paid for it in mechanical fragility. The Tiger I chose individual excellence over production scale and paid for it in numbers Germany could never replace fast enough. The T-34 chose neither extreme. It chose good enough performance wrapped around a production philosophy built for exactly the kind of grinding, years-long industrial war the Eastern Front actually turned out to be. Three very different design philosophies, three very different outcomes, and only one of them was actually built around the war Germany and the Soviet Union ended up fighting rather than the shorter, more decisive war German planners had originally expected. So, back to where we started. In October 1941, a confident, experienced German general wrote home that something fundamental had changed after a smaller, hastily assembled Soviet force stopped his advance using a tank with a cramped two-man turret, no radios in most vehicles, and wildly inconsistent build quality. Both of those things are true at once. The T-34 was flawed, and it was decisive. That's the T-34. Not the tank that never lost a fight, and not the tank that broke down more than it fought, but the tank that was good enough, often enough, in numbers large enough to matter more than either of those other stories ever could. If you want more of these, full single-tank profiles, sourced properly, no inflated casualty figures, subscribe, and we'll keep making them. And here's the question for the comments. Does a tank that wins the war matter more than a tank that wins the individual fight? Was the T-34 actually a great tank, or just the right tank, built in the right numbers at the right time? Tell me where you land, and tell me why.